My name is Parker, and this is my grandpa, and
Hi.
we will be talking about the Vietnam War. How old were you at the time of the Vietnam War?
Well, let's see, I was probably 15.
What was your life like at that time?
At that time, I was living in Orlando, Florida, going to high school, Edgewater High School. Orlando, before Disney, was a great place to grow up because they had lakes, and we would just everywhere you went there was a lake. So we water skied and we fished and we swam and we had parties, and so it was just a wonderful life for a young teenage boy or girl to be growing up in.
Did the war affect your personal life?
The war, I never served in Vietnam, but the war affected me in that there was a draft. And what the draft was the government saying that all young men of certain age had to go off and serve at least 2 years in the Army. And so that affected me because I knew as soon as I turned 18, I would be drafted, unless I went off to college. That was another way to get deferred or get married. So there were different ways. Some people in the United States decided to leave the country and go to Canada. That was a way to avoid the draft. So that meant I needed to look at a way to take care of my government service. And to me at the time, and several of our friends, my friends at the time, decided to go into the United States Navy. So that's how it directly affected my life.
In your opinion, why did the Vietnam War start?
Well, I believe that the Vietnam War started because at that time the United States was very concerned and worried about the spread of communism. At the end of World War II, you had at the time, the Soviet Union spread communism into Eastern Europe, and then the Iron Curtain came along. That's what they call the wall, and the Iron Curtain was the phrase used to describe what was going on between the free Western Europe and the communist Eastern Europe. The wall was there, the Iron Curtain was there to keep the Soviet people in and to keep out the influence from the West. And at the same time, on the other side of the globe, you had the spread of communism coming out of the Soviet Union through China. And so the communists were moving from China down into Southeast Asia at the time. So the United States had this kind of domino theory that once the dominoes, a country that falls to communism starts, then more and more countries would fall to communism. So we were determined to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. That's kind of a broad brush answer to why the war in Vietnam started. Actually, it didn't start with our involvement. Vietnam used to be French Indochina, and the French, that was one of their colonies, and so the Vietnamese wanted to be free of the French, so they were fighting the French to kick them out. The French started backing away. We came in to save the day and stop the spread of communism. That's kind of the reason why we fought the Vietnam War.
What's one memory that has stuck with you?
One of my friends was killed in the Vietnam War. That would have been around 1966. Cal Yates was killed. He was in the Marine Corps, and that was definitely a memory. Another one that was very personal to me is in 1966. I was at Fleet Sonar School in Key West, Florida. And living in Orlando, oftentimes I would hitchhike home from Key West to Orlando. And I remember being in my whites with the little Dixie cup white hat and the nice black kerchief and white outfit. And I'm very harmlessly hitchhiking down the road toward Orlando, and a bus load full of what I believe were college kids pulled up alongside me as I was hitchhiking, and they were yelling profanities out the window, and they were calling me one of LBJ's hired killers. Now, LBJ was the president at the time. That's Lyndon Baines Johnson. So they thought I was, in my harmless little sailor suit, I was one of the killers in Vietnam, but obviously they were wrong.
Mm-hmm. How did the Vietnam War affect the media?
That's an excellent question. I think, and it's still going on today, I think the Vietnam era was the beginning of a very liberal media on TV. In other words, they were taking a side, at least it appears looking back, they were taking a side against the war. And that was completely different than World War II, where during World War II, the newspapers and the radio, because there wasn't much TV at all, very few people had a TV at that time, you'd get your news on the war from going to the movies and the full-tone news and the radio and the newspapers, and it was all very positive for our side. And in fact, they even tried to raise money for U.S. war bonds, and so there was positive propaganda for the war to make people want to give money and buy U.S. war bonds to help raise cash to support the war effort. So that was a very pro-American media at the time. But when Vietnam came along, most Americans had TVs. Probably most of them were black and white, but we still had TVs at that point in time. So Vietnam became the first war